This video is essentially me insisting that all puppers are good doggos and worthy of headpats. Across the mythos of heathenry, there are several good doggos and puppers that should be mentioned. Both dogs and cats were important to the everyday life of the Norse, as well as Vikings specifically. The Norwegian forest cat was a common guest on the ships of Vikings, and the ancestors of the Icelandic sheepdog, among others, were likely on board Viking ships, especially on voyages on which the mission was to build a settlement. In the myths and stories of the gods, however, the more common representation is wolves rather than domesticated dogs, and in many cases they are simply mentioned offhand. But even those of scant mention seem incredibly important, and while I was making this video, I realized that many of them had personalities far deeper than I initially thought, so I've kind of decided to just embrace that journey, and here we go. The first one that I want to talk about doesn't have a name. I just call him the Lombard Wolf, and he's kind of a footnote in this discussion, but I want to talk about him anyway. There's a brief mention of a wolf in the Historia Langobardorum, which, Lord help me if I'm pronouncing that one right, but it's an 8th century record of the history of the Lombards, written by a guy named Paul the Deacon. And it's a historical source that might be useful for people exploring continental heathenry. The Lombards are one of the many tribes that just tore Rome apart during the migration period and wound up settling in the Italian peninsula, supplanting the very heart of the Western Roman Empire. The story contains a moment where a Lombard escapes bondage and is trying to make his way back home to Italy, where the Lombards have settled. And on his way, a wolf appears and becomes his companion. And the man noticed that it would walk ahead of him and would look back at him, and he figured that it was sent from heaven to show him the way. So he follows the wolf for several days through the mountains. And given the association between Odin and wolves, it's possible that this wolf was understood to be associated with the Lombard cognate of Odin, known as Godun. The story of this wolf ends on a rather strange note, as the man begins to starve, and in desperation he shoots at the wolf with his bow. The wolf avoids the shot and then just disappears, so now the man is both starving and lost. The story continues, but the mysterious wolf never appears again, and the wolf was being a good doggo in guiding the Lombard, but since he was not treated like a good doggo, he left. Next up is Geri and Freki, who are the wolves of Odin. Geri means greedy one, and Freki means ravenous one. And they're described in the Poetic Edda as wandering the battlefield, corpse-eager and slaughter-greedy, that their hunger is for the corpses of men fallen in battle, suggesting that they would be wandering the battlefields after conflicts in order to feed on the bodies of the fallen. Obviously fitting pets for the god of death associated with the battlefield in Valhall. In another story in the Poetic Edda, Odin also says, while in disguise, that the Allfather feeds these wolves while he himself subsists only on wine. And not much else is known about Geri and Freki. They are assumed to be Odin's obedient pets, and there's sometimes references as hounds, sometimes as wolves. So there's a question here, because Geri and Freki seem to straddle the line between wild and domesticated, just as Odin, among the first of the Aesir, can straddle the line between Aesir and Jotun at times. Wolves are usually associated in Norse legend with a devouring nature, counter to human interests. And Geri and Freki, in their devouring approach to the battlefield, is in line with that image, but they're still associated with Odin, who is an Aesir. Now, Geri and Freki could be aspects of Odin. They could be entities that accompany Odin, who are more akin to Landvetter rather than gods. But whatever they are, they're incredibly interesting, and the missing information leaves much to the imagination. There's a lot of ideas to discuss about them, but we don't have access to anything that can confirm one way or the other. Next is another pair of wolves called Skoll and Hati, and these are the wolves that chase the sun and the moon. Hati is generally considered the one who will take the moon, and Skoll is the one who will take the sun. And Skoll's name means loud noise, and seems to be a word related to deceiver as well. And Hati's name is roughly one who hates. Now, these names are pretty badass, but you get the trend, right? You get greedy one, ravenous one, deceitful one, hateful one. Wolves get pretty edgy in Norse mythology. The Eddas describe these two wolves. The Poetic Edda describes this moment in the Grimnirsmal. Skoll, a wolf is called, who pursues the shining goddess to the protecting woods. And another is Hati. He is Hrodvitnir's son, who must run before heaven's bright bride. Now, this isn't the clearest of passages, and there's a few ways to take this, and Snorri seems to extrapolate it into this idea that Hati is to chase the moon, or the moon god Mani, whereas Skoll is to chase the sun, or the goddess Suna, or Sol, also known as the shining goddess. Sunna is said to be afraid of Skoll and has no choice but to run. Now, Hati is kind of unique, and he gets this kind of a surname. He's said to be the son of Hrodvatnir, which means famous wolf, a phrase used in the Lokasana to reference Fenrir, the famed wolf of Ragnarok. But it's unclear when or even how Fenrir had this offspring because he was captured at a very young age. Now, Snorri points out a story in the Voluspa and uses it to suggest that Skoll and Hati are brothers, that there is a Jotun that fosters the brood of Fenrir and has many offspring, all of them with the likeness of wolves, and that Hati will become the one who captures and kills the moon god Mani, causing the sky to turn crimson with his gore. And this brings about storms, which sets the stage for Ragnarok, where his father will be finally released. So now that we've discussed the son, let's talk about the father, Fenrir, probably the most famous of wolves in Norse mythology, hence his name, Hrodvatnir, the famous wolf. But his fame comes with good reason, as he is the most complex and the most consequential of the wolves in Norse mythology. Fenrir is sometimes referred to as Fenrisor, the wolf of Fenrir, which hasn't quite been explained as a concept, as it seems that Fenrir is the wolf. Whatever the case, there are two major stories in which he is featured, one of which he is responsible for Tyr's missing hand, and the other is Ragnarok, where he is said to be the one who kills Odin himself. The majority of the understanding that we have of Fenrir comes from Snorri, because Snorri is prone to extrapolation and inserting his own interpretation. So it's worth considering some of the aspects of this story might be corrupted from whatever its earlier form may have been, but it's also the story we have. So with that bias in mind, here's the story. Fenrir is the son of Loki, along with a brother and sister who were said in prophecies to be the source of misfortune and evil. One is Jormungandr, the great Midgard serpent. The other is Hel, the goddess of death. Jormungandr is thrown into the sea. Hel is given dominion over death, but must leave Asgard. And Fenrir is kept among the gods and raised in Asgard, though only Tyr had the courage to approach him and feed him. But he grew to be so large in size that the gods became concerned, owing to this prophecy that Fenrir would cause them trouble, and they decided to attempt to bind him. The gods treated the binding attempts as a game to see if Fenrir was strong enough to break the bindings, and Fenrir played along and broke through the first attempts quite easily. But when the gods approached him with what seemed to be like this silken bond, he was a bit skeptical. He noted that it would be unsurprising to break through such a fragile bond, so there must be something exceptional about it. And the gods promised him that if he were unable to break free from this, then they wouldn't have any need to fear him, so he would just be set free. The wolf was skeptical of this one as well, and he responded by saying that if he were trapped by such a binding, then the gods would betray and abandon him, and they wouldn't have any reason to free him. And he called them out, saying instead of insulting his courage, that one of the gods placed their hand in his mouth while they bind him as a pledge that there be no treachery here. Tyr volunteers and places his sword hand in Fenrir's mouth. And Fenrir was bound and realized that he could not escape, much to the delight and the laughter of the gods. And Fenrir responded to this by biting off Tyr's hand at the wrist, punishing him for broken promises and betrayal. The gods then hung him, bound, and Fenrir tried to take a bite out of them, but the gods wedged a sword into his mouth, with the hilt in his lower gums and the blade digging into his upper gums, and there he stays until Ragnarok. And this brings in an interesting question. Did the gods fulfill prophecy by treating Fenrir in this way? Did they give Fenrir the motivation for revenge? We don't get very much information from Snorri on Fenrir's character before his binding. Time had passed. He was obviously very intelligent. The gods were already afraid of him. He could have committed several misdeeds that informed the gods' decision to eventually bind him. But he also could have been a fine pupper that only desired headpats and was instead maltreated on the basis of some vague prophecy. But he's also a wolf. And the common association in Norse myths with wolves is that they are these devourers. And Fenrir is the ultimate wolf, and therefore the ultimate devourer. But there are theories that Fenrir, Hati, and Skoll are all the same wolf that was divided up by Snorri into several entities. This would lend to the narrative that the binding was, in fact, to protect Sunna and Mani, and that when Fenrir breaks from his bindings, in his bloodlust he kills them first. But that would be a further extrapolation and is one idea among many to discuss on Fenrir. But let's dig a little bit deeper. Another idea to entertain about Fenrir is that he is the offspring of god-level entities and yet has the form of a wolf. A big question when discussing Fenrir is to ask why that is. His parents, one of which being Loki, the other a Jotun, are not wolves, and yet he is still depicted as a wolf. But he's not just an animal. He's intelligent, he's crafty, he's stern, and he's fearsome enough to cause the gods themselves concern. He's depicted as a wolf, and this is a form that either the storyteller has chosen or that Fenrir himself has chosen, again, as the ultimate wolf, and therefore the ultimate devourer. So let me know y'all's ideas about Fenrir in the comments, because I'm interested in your thoughts, because he's a very complex entity with what little we have, and honestly, the missing information builds more mystery around him, which inevitably makes him more interesting. So I'd love to hear y'all's opinions on this, because y'all in the comments bring some really interesting perspectives, and that's always awesome. But it is important to note, Fenrir gets his day. When Ragnarok begins, the sun and the moon are killed. Fenrir's jaws cover the sky. Fire burns from his eyes, and Odin comes out to face him. And a great battle takes place, where Odin is killed by the wolf. But what of Tyr? Fenrir would have likely had a vendetta against Tyr, but Tyr's fate is not mentioned in the Voluspa. And there's more to discuss there, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. After bringing about the end of Odin himself, Vidar, son of Odin, thrusts his sword into Fenrir's heart, killing him. Snorri, on the other hand, records this death as Vidar ripping Fenrir apart at the jaw, and thus ends the story of Fenrir. Next is Sam. Sam can only be described as the bestest boy and the most deserving of headpats. It's likely that Sam was an Irish wolfhound, which were said to be these huge and excellent guard dogs, and an ancient breed, thousands of years old. The breed of antiquity doesn't exist anymore, but there's a modern breed of the Irish wolfhound that was created in the 19th century by some really, really excited dog lovers, but it's not quite the same dog. The description, though, in Njál's saga of Sam is similar to that of the many attestations surrounding that pre-modern Irish wolfhound. In the saga, Sam is a dog that is given to Gunnar Hamundarson by Olaf Peacock, and he describes Sam as a dog that was given to me in Ireland. He is large and no worse a companion than a strong man. And he also has the intelligence of a man. He will bark at anyone he knows to be your enemy, but never at your friends. And he can also see in any man whether he means you well or ill, and he will lay down his life out of loyalty to you. The dog's name is Sam. And then Olaf says to Sam, "Go with Gunnar now, and serve him the best you can." And Sam obediently goes at once to Gunnar, and lays down at his feet. Afterward, Sam is mentioned as the reason why no one will make trouble with Gunnar while he's at home, despite the huge number of people he had killed both to settle scores and in self-defense. Gunnar was already this reputed warrior himself, with a trusty halberd that seemed to make shields just absolutely worthless. And with Sam at his side, he was seen as just impossible to kill. And Gunnar loved Sam and would treat him like a member of the family. However, a plan is hatched to kill Gunnar, but it's decided that first they have to deal with Sam. The attackers kidnap a neighboring farmer named Thorkel, and they give him a choice. He can either go to Gunnar's house and take the dog, or they'd kill him. And he chose to keep his own life, and he went down to take Sam from Gunnar's house. When they approached the house, Sam could be seen lying on the roof of the house. Thorkel went to lure him away, and Sam was cooperative at first because he recognized Thorkel. But he noticed the other men approaching the home, and when he saw this, he jumped at Thorkel and bit him in the groin. And a man named Ornund came and hit Sam with an axe. And Sam gave a howl like none of the men had ever heard before. And then Sam fell dead. Gunnar woke from the howl and said, "You've been cruelly used, my foster child Sam, and it is to be expected that our deaths are meant to be close together." And as the men approached his home, Gunnar saw a red tunic outside of his window, and he grabbed his halberd. He made a thrust with his halberd through the window and hit one of the attackers in the waist. The attacker, Thorgrim was badly wounded and just fell off the roof. Another of the attackers approached Thorgrim and asked if Gunnar was at home. And Thorgrim answered, "You find out for yourselves. But I found out one thing. His halberd's at home." And then he promptly died. The story of Sam shows a few things about heathen relationships with dogs and pets in general. They're seen as part of the family. And the love between us and our pets is mutual. And treat your pets well, and they'll treat you well. If you want to hunt this story down, it's in Njál's Saga. Sam's story is told through chapters 70 and 76. I don't want to tell the rest of the struggle because Njál's Saga is an excellent story, and Gunnar is one of the best characters in a saga filled with incredible characters with various motives. Even the villains of this story are just entirely understandable, even if you hate what they do, which is part of what makes a great story, in my opinion. The last is Garmr, who is mentioned by Odin as being the best of hounds, which is honestly proof positive that Odin isn't omniscient, because really it should be Sam. But whatever the case, there's some speculation over whether or not Garmr was just another name for Fenrir, which is suggested by a line in the Voluspa, which Garmr's howl is part of the refrain stanza that also references the fetters bursting to set Fenrir loose. However, Odin suggesting that Garmr is the best of hounds when referencing Fenrir, the wolf fated to kill him, that he just spent a lot of time imprisoning, either doesn't fit or is sarcastic flattery that doesn't quite register. Personally, I go with the usage that the name Garmr is to reference the guard dog of Helheim. My personal but very dumb kenning for him is the Hellpupper. No, Ocean, heathenry is super serious all the time. The poem Baldur's Dream in the Poetic Edda references an unnamed blood-stained dog who stands at the gates of Helheim and even barks at Odin, the Allfather, as he attempts to enter the land of the dead. He is seen as the guardian of Helheim, against both the living trying to enter the land of the dead and the dead trying to enter the land of the living. This is the hound that is often assigned the name Garmr and is associated with the death goddess, Hel, as this is the dog guarding the high halls of Hel. Garmr has been likened to Cerberus as the guard dog of the underworld, and there are similarities. Garmr is seen as the pet of the ruler of the realm of the dead, the goddess Hel, in this case, daughter of Loki and one of the more powerful deities in the Norse pantheon. But personally, I tend to see comparisons like that as prone to oversimplification. Garmr is his own pupper, worthy of his own headpats, though likely only needs about a third of the headpats that are due to Cerberus. There is also Snorri's telling of Garmr at Ragnarok, in which he finds and kills Tyr. They kill each other, actually. Snorri mentions this rather offhandedly, and it's not entirely clear where he gets the idea. Tyr's death is not recorded in the Voluspa, nor is Garmr's fight with him. But Snorri might be making a distinction where there isn't one, and speaking of another legend where the struggle between Fenrir and Tyr comes to a head, and Fenrir takes his revenge, and they kill each other. One possible idea that would support that is that Garmr is another name for Fenrir, and that the hellhound guarding the gates of Helheim actually had some other name that has just been lost to time. But this isn't something that we can confirm right now, and we likely just never will. But personally, I think that when Odin refers to Garmr as the best of hounds, it makes far more sense that he's referring to the guardian of the dead, the hound that Odin himself had come across on his journey to the land of the dead, and the hound that even when standing face to face with the Allfather, showed no fear. I hope you all enjoyed this one. Again, I wound up finding out these beings are just far more complicated than I thought they would be. My appreciation for these entities definitely increased while I was making this video, which is just cool when it happens, like, honestly. Before heading out, I do want to drop some fun news. First, I voiced a part for a friend and fellow YouTuber, Prophet of Zod, in one of his animations. I played the Ghost of Cancellations Past, which was honestly a load of fun. I've also peeked back up on Twitch lately, done some like Skyrim streaming. I don't get to do that very often, but when I do, it's a lot of fun, so I hope to see y'all there. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Give the subscribe button headpats and bind the bell until Ragnarok. And remember to find a way or make one. Here's you encouraging everybody to boycott Nike and set their shoes on fire. That was smart.